The Colorado Rockies had turned into a white-knuckled nightmare, and Sarah Chen was running out of time. 8 months pregnant and stranded when her car skidded off the mountain road, she stumbled through knee-deep snow as contractions began rippling through her body. The blizzard screamed around her like a living thing, hungry and relentless. Then she saw it. A stone hut, impossibly old, carved into the mountainside like it had been waiting for her. Inside, ancient symbols covered every wall, symbols she recognized from her grandmother's forbidden journals. The ones her family had burned when Grandma died. The ones that spoke of blood sacrifices and things that should never be born. But it was the altar in the center that made her blood freeze. Fresh flowers, burning candles, and a photograph of herself, taken just yesterday, with her unborn child's face somehow visible in her belly, its eyes glowing an unnatural blue. Someone had been expecting her. Someone knew exactly when she would arrive. But who could have predicted she'd get lost in this storm, unless the storm wasn't an accident at all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's legs trembled as another contraction seized her, forcing her to grip the rough stone doorframe. The wind howled behind her, but inside the hut, the air hung eerily still. The candles flickered without any breeze to disturb them, their flames dancing in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. She stepped closer to the altar, her breath misting in the cold air. The photograph was crisp, professional quality, not a grainy surveillance shot. Someone had taken this at her doctor's appointment yesterday in Denver, but that was impossible. The waiting room had been empty except for her and the receptionist. The baby in the ultrasound image superimposed on her belly looked nothing like any normal fetal scan. Its features were too defined, too knowing. And those eyes, they seemed to track her movement as she circled the altar. "This isn't real," she whispered, but her voice cracked with uncertainty. The symbols carved into the walls pulsed faintly in the candlelight. Sarah recognized them now, remembering stolen glimpses of her grandmother's journals before her mother had discovered her reading them. Grandma Popo had always been the family oddity, muttering in what everyone assumed was broken Mandarin, drawing strange diagrams in the margins of newspapers. But these symbols weren't Chinese. They were something far older. A memory surfaced unbidden, her grandmother grabbing her wrist when she was 12, pressing something cold and metallic into her palm. "When the time comes," Popo had whispered urgently, "you must choose, the child or the bloodline, never both." Sarah had forgotten about the small silver pendant until now, but her hand instinctively moved to her throat. It was still there, hidden beneath her sweater, growing warm against her skin. The wind outside suddenly died, leaving an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and erratic, and underneath it, something else, a second heartbeat that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. On the altar beside the photograph lay an ornate knife, its blade black with age, but sharp enough to catch the light. Fresh scratches marred the stone surface beneath it, dark stains that looked disturbingly recent. Sarah backed away, but her retreat was blocked by another contraction, stronger than the last. She doubled over, gasping, and when she straightened, she wasn't alone. An elderly woman sat in the corner where empty space had been moments before. She wore traditional Chinese robes, but her face was wrong, too young for her white hair, too knowing for any human expression. When she smiled, her teeth were filed to points. "Hello, granddaughter." The voice was Popo's, but Popo had died 5 years ago. Sarah had seen the body, attended the funeral. Her mother had cremated the remains personally, as if afraid of what might happen otherwise. "You're not real," Sarah said, though her conviction wavered. The woman looked solid, casting shadows in the candlelight. "Reality is flexible here," the figure replied, gesturing at the walls. "This place exists between worlds. It's where choices are made and prices are paid." Another contraction hit, and Sarah realized with growing terror that they were coming faster now. The storm might have been a coincidence, but her labor wasn't waiting for rescue. "The child comes early," Popo's doppelganger observed with satisfaction. "The old blood calls to it. It knows what it must become." Sarah's pendant burned against her throat, and she remembered her grandmother's final words. "Some bloodlines carry gifts, others carry curses. Yours carries both." The photograph on the altar began to smoke at the edges, the unnatural blue eyes in the ultrasound image growing brighter. Outside, she could hear something moving in the snow, footsteps that circled the hut in a pattern that matched the symbols on the walls. She was trapped between the storm and whatever waited in the darkness, with only her unborn child and a grandmother who shouldn't exist for company. The warmth hit Elena like a physical embrace as she stumbled through the doorway, her numb fingers fumbling to pull the heavy wooden door shut behind her. The wind's howl became muffled, reduced to a distant whisper that seemed almost peaceful compared to the chaos she'd escaped. She stood there for a moment, back pressed against the door, breathing heavily and letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior. The hut was larger than it had appeared from outside, with rough-hewn stone walls that stretched up into shadowy rafters. A small fire crackled in what looked like an ancient hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. The sight of it made her pause. Someone had been here recently, very recently. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the space. "Is anyone here?" Silence answered her, broken only by the soft pop and hiss of burning wood. Elena pulled off her snow-crusted gloves and rubbed her hands together, grateful for the blessed warmth. The baby stirred again, a gentle flutter that reminded her why she needed to survive this night. As her eyes grew accustomed to the firelight, she began to make out more details. The hut was clearly old, centuries old, judging by the construction, but it was far from abandoned. A simple wooden table sat near the fire, its surface marked with deep gouges that looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. Shelves lined one wall, filled with glass jars containing what appeared to be dried herbs and other unidentifiable substances that glinted dully in the amber light. Elena moved deeper into the room, her wet boots squelching against the stone floor. A narrow staircase led up to what she assumed was a sleeping loft, but her attention was drawn to something else entirely. Hanging on the wall opposite the fireplace was a collection of old photographs, their edges yellowed with age. She approached them slowly, something about their arrangement striking her as oddly familiar. The photos were organized in what looked like family groupings, spanning decades if not longer. As she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the center photograph looked exactly like her. Elena's hand instinctively moved to her throat, fingers tracing the small birthmark just below her left ear, the same birthmark clearly visible on the woman in the picture. The photograph was old, probably from the 1940s based on the clothing and sepia tone, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Same dark hair, same angular cheekbones, same intense green eyes that Elena saw every morning in the mirror. "This isn't possible," she whispered, leaning closer. The woman in the photograph stood in front of this very hut, though it looked somehow different, newer, despite being captured decades ago. Behind her, barely visible in the background, stood several other figures whose faces were turned away from the camera or obscured by shadow. Elena's gaze moved to the other photographs. More women, all bearing a striking resemblance to her, spanning what appeared to be generations. Some were clearly from different eras. She could see the evolution of clothing and photographic techniques, but the faces were hauntingly similar, as if the same woman had been photographed across decades, defying the passage of time. The baby kicked hard, making her gasp and step back from the wall. The movement brought her attention to a thick leather journal sitting open on the table beside the fireplace. The pages were covered in handwritten notes, the ink still wet enough to glisten in the firelight. Elena approached the journal cautiously, as if it might spring at her like some wild animal. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the words flowing across the page in what appeared to be multiple languages. English she could read, but there were passages in what looked like Latin, and symbols she didn't recognize at all. The most recent entry was dated today. The bloodline cause. She comes as foretold, carrying the next vessel. The circle must be completed before the child draws breath in this world. The sisterhood has waited long enough. Elena's hands began to shake as she read the words again, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Sisterhood, vessel. And how could an entry be dated today when she'd found this place by pure chance, fleeing from a storm she couldn't have predicted? She flipped back through the pages, her heart racing as she found more entries, more dates, going back months. All written in the same hand, all referencing someone's arrival, someone who carried the next in line. References to her grandmother's maiden name, Blackthorn, appeared repeatedly, along with mentions of the pact and payment due. A log in the fireplace shifted, sending up a shower of sparks and casting new shadows across the walls. In that brief, brighter light, Elena saw something that made her blood freeze. Carved into the stone above the fireplace, so subtle she'd missed it before, was her name. Not just any name that happened to match hers. Her full name, Elena Marie Blackthorn Morrison, including the married name she'd only taken 6 months ago. The storm's fury had subsided to a low moan, but Elena barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the journal, its yellowed pages trembling in her shaking hands. The leather binding felt warm against her palms, as if it had absorbed decades of secrets and now pulsed with their weight. She opened to the first entry, dated 37 years ago. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, written in fading blue ink that had turned almost purple with age. Day 1. They brought me here against my will. The elders say it's for the safety of the child, but I know the truth. They're afraid of what I might bear, afraid of what runs in our blood. Elena's breath caught. The timing was impossible to ignore. 37 years ago was exactly when her mother would have been pregnant with her. Her fingers traced the words, searching for some indication that this was mere coincidence. Day 3. The pains have started early, too early. Something is wrong. The baby moves strangely, as if it knows what it is, as if it remembers. The journal slipped from Elena's numb fingers as her own baby gave a sharp kick, so violent it made her gasp. She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the child writhe beneath her skin with an urgency that seemed almost responsive to the words she'd just read. "No," she whispered to the empty hut. "This isn't possible." But even as she denied it, fragments of her childhood began reassembling themselves in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she'd never realized she was solving. Her mother's inexplicable fear of family gatherings, the way distant relatives would cross themselves when they looked at Elena, their eyes filled with something that went beyond mere disapproval. The strange dreams that had plagued her since childhood, dreams of stone corridors and chanting voices that spoke in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. She retrieved the journal with trembling hands and continued reading. Day 7. Dr. Thorne visited again today. He brought more of the old books, the ones written in the ancient tongue. He says I must understand what's happening to me, what's been happening to the women in our family for generations. The curse didn't die with my grandmother as we'd hoped. It merely waited. Elena's blood turned to ice. Dr. Thorne had been her mother's physician, the man who'd delivered Elena herself. She remembered his visits to their house when she was small, how her mother would send her to her room, but she'd crouch at the top of the stairs and listen to their hushed, urgent conversations that always seemed to revolve around bloodlines and family histories. Day 10. I felt it today, truly felt it for the first time. The thing inside me isn't just a child. It's something else, something that's been passed down through our line like a genetic disease. But this isn't science. This is older, darker. The women in our family don't just give birth, we give vessel. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena doubled over with a sharp cry. It felt as though tiny claws were scraping against her ribs from the inside. When the sensation passed, she found herself staring at the stone walls around her, really seeing them for the first time. The symbols carved into the rock weren't random. They formed a pattern, a circle of protection that encompassed the entire interior of the hut. And there, barely visible in the dim light, were dark stains on the floor beneath where she sat, stains that looked suspiciously like old blood. Her hands shook as she turned to the final entries in the journal. Day 14. It's time. I can feel the change beginning. Dr. Thorne says the ritual circle will contain it, will force it to remain dormant until the next generation. I pray he's right. I pray my daughter will never have to know what she carries. Day 15. Elena was born at sunset. She appears normal, beautiful even. Dr. Thorne says the binding worked, that the entity is sleeping deep within her bloodline. It may never wake, but if it does, if she ever finds herself back in this place, if the signs manifest in her own pregnancy, God forgive me, I should have broken the cycle. I should have been stronger. The journal's final entry was written in a different hand, clearly belonging to Dr. Thorne. The mother died in childbirth, as they always do. The child has been taken to live with the father, who knows nothing of this family's burden. The hut is sealed. May God grant that it remains so. Elena's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her. She wasn't just seeking shelter from a storm. She was fulfilling a destiny that had been written before her birth. The dreams, the strange sensations during her pregnancy, even the inexplicable compulsion that had driven her to this exact spot during the blizzard. None of it was coincidence. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, but now it sounded different, less like weather and more like whispers, like something calling her name. The carved symbols seemed to pulse in the flickering candlelight, their ancient lines weaving patterns that hurt to look at directly. Elena pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breathing shallow as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The symbols weren't just decorations, they told a story. Her trembling fingers traced the air above the carvings, not quite daring to touch them. The leftmost panel showed figures in robes gathered around what appeared to be an altar. The next depicted a woman, belly swollen with child, kneeling before the robed figures. Elena's heart hammered as she moved to the third panel. The pregnant woman lay on the altar now, surrounded by flames that seemed to dance even in the static carving. But it was the fourth panel that made Elena's blood freeze. The woman's belly was open, empty, and above the altar floated something that wasn't quite human, something with too many limbs and eyes that seemed to bore into Elena's soul, even from carved stone. "No," she whispered, stumbling backward. Her heel caught on something, and she looked down to see she'd kicked over a small clay vessel. Dark powder spilled across the floor, releasing a smell like burnt copper and rotting flowers. The wind outside had grown eerily quiet. Elena realized she could no longer hear the howling that had driven her to seek shelter. In the sudden silence, every sound seemed amplified. Her ragged breathing, the rapid thud of her heartbeat, the soft crackling of the candle flames. She needed to leave. Whatever this place was, whatever those symbols meant, she needed to get out. But as she turned toward the entrance, her path was blocked by the tall wooden chest she'd noticed earlier. In the candlelight, she could see it was positioned deliberately, as if someone had moved it there after she'd entered. Elena's hands shook as she tried to push the chest aside, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was ancient but solid, carved with the same disturbing symbols that covered the walls. She pressed her shoulder against it, straining, but it felt rooted to the spot. Behind her, something rustled. She spun around, heart leaping into her throat. The dried herbs hanging from the ceiling swayed gently, though there was no wind inside the hut. As she watched, one of the bundles, what looked like twisted roots bound with sinew, began to smoke without any flame touching it. The acrid smell filled her nostrils, making her dizzy. Elena pressed her sleeve against her nose and mouth, fighting the urge to gag. The smoke wasn't dissipating. Instead, it was gathering in the center of the room, forming shapes that defied logic. Through the haze, she saw movement in the shadows beyond the candlelight. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks, but then she heard it, a sound like fingernails scraping against stone, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" The word escaped before she could stop it, her voice cracking with fear. The scraping stopped. Elena's baby kicked violently, as if responding to her terror. She placed both hands protectively over her belly, whispering soothing words as much for herself as for the child. But even as she tried to calm down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the darkness. The candles began to flicker more erratically, their flames bending in impossible directions. In the dancing light, the carved symbols seemed to shift and change, telling their story in an endless hypnotic loop. Elena found herself drawn back to the wall, studying the panels with a horrible fascination. In the final carving, one she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the deepest shadow, she saw herself. Not similar to her, not representing her. It was unmistakably Elena's face, carved into stone that had to be centuries old. The carved Elena stood in a doorway, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other reaching toward something in the darkness beyond the frame. "This isn't real," she said aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This can't be real." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang false. Everything about this place felt ancient and purposeful, as if it had been waiting for her specifically. The symbols, the position of the chest blocking her exit, even the timing of the storm that had driven her here, it all felt orchestrated. Elena's grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "Some doors shouldn't be opened, child. Some paths lead nowhere good." She'd always assumed it was just the rambling of an old woman haunted by her past in the mountains. Now she wondered if it had been a warning. The scraping sound resumed, closer this time. Elena pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cold stone through her coat. Whatever was moving in the shadows beyond the candlelight, it was getting braver, circling closer with each pass. She closed her eyes and tried to think of David, safe and warm in their apartment in the city. But when she opened them again, one of the candles had gone out, and the darkness had crept noticeably closer. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Sarah pressed herself deeper into the stone hut's shadows. The bundle in her arms had grown cold, its weight somehow heavier than before. She couldn't bring herself to look at it again, not after what she'd seen carved into those impossibly small bones. Her phone's flashlight beam trembled across the walls, revealing more symbols etched into the ancient stone. They weren't random scratches made by desperate travelers seeking shelter. These markings were deliberate, purposeful, carved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah winced and shifted position, her back aching from hunching over the horrific discovery. Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed fury, but inside the hut, an oppressive silence seemed to press against her eardrums. She forced herself to examine the symbols more closely. Some looked familiar in a way that made her stomach churn, not because she'd seen them before, but because they triggered something deep in her subconscious, like a half-remembered nightmare. Spirals within spirals, intersected by jagged lines that resembled lightning or tree branches, or veins. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Some bloodlines carry more than just physical traits, Sarah. Some carry obligations." At the time, she dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman losing her grip on reality. Grandmother Elena had always been eccentric, filling Sarah's childhood with strange stories about their family's origins in the old country, tales of women who could predict storms and speak with the dead. Sarah's mother had forbidden such talk, always changing the subject whenever Elena began her cryptic warnings about the debt that must be paid. Now, staring at symbols that seemed to pulse in the wavering light, those warnings didn't seem so crazy. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. She was 7 years old, standing in her grandmother's kitchen while the old woman prepared a strange tea that smelled of copper and earth. Elena's hands had been steady despite her age, measuring herbs with the confidence of long practice. "Every third generation, Sarah," Elena had whispered, her voice barely audible over the kettle's whistle. "Every third generation, one of us must give back what was taken. It's the only way to keep the rest safe." "Give back what?" young Sarah had asked. Elena's eyes had grown distant. What our ancestors stole to save her own child. The bargain she made in desperation, thinking she was so clever. The old woman had laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. The debt always comes due, always. Sarah's mother had appeared in the doorway then, face flushed with anger. "Mother, stop filling her head with nonsense." She'd grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her away. "Those are just stories, superstitions from the old country. They have nothing to do with us." But Elena had caught Sarah's wrist as they passed, her grip surprisingly strong. "Count the generations, little one. Your great-great-grandmother, then your great-aunt Magdalena who died in childbirth, and now—" Elena's eyes had dropped to Sarah's mother's rounded belly. Sarah's mother had been pregnant with her younger brother at the time. "Now it's your mother's turn to choose." The memory ended abruptly as a new sound penetrated the storm's fury. Sarah held her breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a rhythmic scraping like claws against stone. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath her. Sarah scrambled to her feet, the bone bundle clutched against her chest. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to dig its way up through the hut's floor. The symbols on the walls seemed to flicker in response, though she knew it had to be a trick of her unsteady flashlight. Her great-aunt Magdalena had died in childbirth, she remembered now. So had her great-great-grandmother, though family records were vague about the circumstances. Both deaths had been attributed to complications, tragic but not unusual for women of their respective eras. But what if they hadn't been complications at all? The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving only the wind's mournful song. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she swept the flashlight beam across the floor. The stones looked undisturbed, fitted together so tightly that not even weeds could grow between them. Yet she could swear the sound had come from directly below where she stood. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her jump. A text message from David, road still blocked. "Stay put until morning. Love you both." Both. He was thinking about the baby, their baby, due in just 2 months. Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly as a terrible thought began to take shape. Every third generation. Her grandmother's words echoed with new meaning. If the pattern held true, if Elena's stories were more than just superstition, then Sarah wasn't just the latest in a line of women touched by tragedy. She was next. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light as Sarah traced them with trembling fingers. Each touch sent waves of recognition through her mind, as if unlocking memories that weren't quite her own. The stone was warm beneath her palm, impossibly warm for something that should have been frozen solid in this bitter cold. She pulled her hand back, gasping. The moment her skin left the stone, the images flooding her mind crystallized into something terrifyingly coherent. A woman with Sarah's own dark hair and pale eyes, standing in this very hut. But not as it was now, newer then, with fresh mortar between the stones and wooden shelves lining the walls. The woman wore a long coat that Sarah somehow knew was deep burgundy, though the vision came to her in shades of grey. The woman was pregnant. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the spectral figure move through the hut with familiar gestures, arranging items on those long vanished shelves. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. Glass bottles caught what little light filtered through the single window, their contents dark and mysterious. This wasn't just any woman, this was family. The vision shifted, and Sarah saw the woman's face more clearly. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same stubborn chin, the same slightly crooked nose that Sarah had always assumed came from her father's side. But her father had told her his family came from Ireland, not from whatever ancient place this was. Another wave of pain gripped Sarah's abdomen, stronger this time. She doubled over, one hand clutching her belly, the other braced against the carved stone. The moment her palm touched the symbols again, the vision exploded into vivid color and sound. The woman was screaming. Not in pain, but in rage. Her hands were raised above her head, and words poured from her lips in a language Sarah didn't recognize but somehow understood. The air around the woman shimmered with heat, and the herbs hanging from the ceiling began to smoke and twist as if caught in an invisible fire. Outside the hut, Sarah could hear other voices, men's voices, angry and afraid. They were shouting about devils and witches, about unholy things that needed to be cleansed from the earth. The woman's voice rose above theirs, defiant and terrible, calling down curses that made the very stones of the hut tremble. Sarah jerked her hand away again, her heart hammering. The silence that followed felt deafening after the chaos of the vision, but in that silence she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps in the snow outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that circled the hut once, twice, then stopped directly in front of the door. Sarah held her breath, straining to listen. The wind had died down, making every sound sharp and clear in the crystalline air. A knock echoed through the small space, 3 slow, measured raps against the ancient wood. Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't heard a car engine, hadn't seen headlights cutting through the storm. How had someone found her here, in this isolated place that didn't appear on any map she'd ever seen? Sarah. The voice was muffled by the door, but unmistakably feminine. Sarah, dear, I know you're in there. The woman knew her name, knew she was here, but that was impossible. No one knew where she was. She'd told Marcus she was going to her sister's house, 3 states away. Her phone had no signal. There was no way anyone could have tracked her to this place. Don't be afraid, child. I'm here to help. The voice was warm, almost grandmotherly, but something about it made Sarah's skin crawl. There was an undercurrent to it, a quality that reminded her of the woman in her vision, the same cadence, the same subtle accent she couldn't quite place. Your baby needs you to be strong now. Both of your babies. Sarah's hand flew to her throat. Both of her babies? The ultrasound had shown only 1 heartbeat, 1 tiny form growing inside her. The technician had been very clear about that. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I know what you've seen, Sarah. I know what you're beginning to remember. The gifts don't always skip generations, you know. Sometimes they lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Gifts. The word sent ice through Sarah's veins. She thought of her grandmother, the one who died when Sarah was barely walking, the grandmother her father never talked about, whose photographs had mysteriously disappeared from the family albums, the one her mother would only describe as troubled before quickly changing the subject. Open the door, Sarah. Let me help you understand what you are. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to the stranger's words. And for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she felt a second flutter, fainter, but unmistakably there, in a place where no second baby should be. The symbols carved into the stone walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as Elena traced her fingertips across their ancient grooves. Each touch sent a strange warmth through her hand, and she could swear she felt the baby respond with a gentle kick, as if recognizing something familiar in these mysterious markings. The storm outside had intensified, its howling wind creating an eerie symphony that seemed to harmonize with the whispers she kept hearing from the shadows. Elena tried to convince herself it was just the wind finding cracks in the old stone, but deep down she knew better. The voices were growing clearer, more insistent, and they all seemed to be calling the same name, Mirabelle. Her grandmother's name echoed through the hut like a prayer, and Elena felt her blood turn to ice. How could these voices know about Mirabelle? Her grandmother had died when Elena was just 7, taking most of the family stories with her to the grave. Elena's mother had always been reluctant to speak about Mirabelle, changing the subject whenever Elena asked about her grandmother's life before coming to America. The wooden box she'd found earlier sat open beside her, its contents spread across the rough stone floor. Among the yellowed photographs and brittle documents, one particular image kept drawing her attention. It showed a young woman standing in front of what looked like the very hut where Elena now sheltered. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but her stance, her profile, something about her was hauntingly familiar. Elena picked up the photograph with trembling fingers and held it closer to the flickering light of her phone's flashlight. The woman in the image was clearly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly in the exact same gesture Elena found herself making unconsciously. But what made Elena's breath catch in her throat was the pendant hanging around the woman's neck, an intricate silver amulet that Elena recognized immediately. She reached beneath her own collar and pulled out the necklace her grandmother had given her years ago. The pendant was identical to the one in the photograph, down to the smallest detail of its twisted silver branches and the dark stone set at its center. Mirabelle had told her it was a family heirloom, something that had been passed down through generations of women in their bloodline. For protection, her grandmother had whispered as she'd fastened the chain around Elena's young neck. "Promise me you'll never take it off. Promise me you'll pass it on to your daughter when the time comes." Elena had made that promise without understanding its significance, but now, staring at the photograph, a terrible understanding began to dawn on her. The woman in the image wasn't just wearing the same pendant, she was wearing Elena's pendant. This photograph was older than it had any right to be, and yet there was no denying the evidence before her eyes. She flipped the photograph over and found writing on the back, faded but still legible, "Mirabelle Thorne, 1952. The covenant is renewed." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Her grandmother would have been barely 20 in 1952, but the woman in this photograph looked exactly as Elena remembered Mirabelle from her childhood. The same lined face, the same silver hair, the same knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets too dark for daylight. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena gasped as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. For a moment, she thought she might be going into labor, but then the pain subsided, leaving behind only a strange tingling sensation that seemed to radiate from the pendant against her skin. The voices in the shadows grew louder, and now Elena could make out words beyond her grandmother's name. They spoke of cycles and bloodlines, of sacrifices made and debts to be paid. They whispered of women who had come before her, each carrying the burden of an ancient agreement, each playing their part in maintaining a balance between worlds that should never touch. Elena scrambled to gather more documents from the box, searching desperately for answers that might explain what she was experiencing. Her hands shook as she unfolded a piece of parchment that looked far older than the photographs. The writing was in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow, impossibly, she found she could understand every word. The document spoke of a pact made centuries ago, a bargain struck between her ancestors and something that existed in the spaces between sleep and waking. Each generation, one woman from the bloodline would serve as a vessel, carrying forward a legacy that transcended normal human understanding. The pendant was not just a family heirloom, it was a key, and the hut where she now sought shelter was not a random refuge, but a sacred space where the covenant was renewed. As Elena read, she realized with growing horror that her pregnancy was no accident, and her presence in this place during the storm was no coincidence. Everything had been orchestrated, planned across generations, leading to this moment when she would finally understand the true nature of her inheritance. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Sarah traced her trembling finger along the carved stone. Each character felt ice-cold beneath her touch, as if the very rock was trying to warn her away. But she couldn't stop herself from following the spiral pattern that wound deeper into the hut's walls, drawn by a compulsion she didn't understand. The wind outside had died to an eerie whisper, and in that sudden silence she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the hut. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The baby kicked violently, as if sensing her terror. Through the narrow window, she caught glimpses of a dark figure moving in the swirling snow, tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like a tattered cloak that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the pale moonlight. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A voice drifted through the ancient wood, speaking in the same guttural language she'd heard whispered in her dreams. The words were incomprehensible, yet somehow familiar, like half-remembered lullabies from childhood. As the voice continued its rhythmic chanting, the symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her grandmother's necklace, and the moment her fingers touched the pendant, The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more terrifying than any sound. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the door, like claws or fingernails dragging down the wood. The sound sent shivers of recognition through Sarah's body. She'd heard it before, in her childhood bedroom on nights when the moon was dark. Her parents had always dismissed it as branches against the window, but she'd known better. Something had been trying to get in. The scratching moved to the walls, circling the hut with methodical precision. Sarah followed the sound, her back pressed against the interior walls, until she realized with growing horror that the scratching was following the exact pattern of the carved symbols. Whatever was outside knew the markings intimately. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her grandmother's funeral, the strange mourners who'd stood apart from the family, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. She remembered overhearing fragments of conversation, words like bloodline and covenant, and the old ways must be preserved. Her parents had hurried her away whenever she'd gotten too close to listen. The scratching stopped. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any sound from outside. The silence stretched on until she began to wonder if she'd imagined it all. Then came a new sound that made her knees buckle with terror. Her grandmother's voice, clear as day, calling her name. "Sarah, child, open the door." The voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm and loving, tinged with the slight accent her grandmother had never quite lost. But her grandmother had been dead for 15 years. "I've been waiting so long to see you again, dearie, to meet my great-grandchild." Sarah's hand moved toward the door handle without her conscious will, drawn by the beloved voice. The baby inside her seemed to respond as well, its movements becoming urgent, almost eager. "That's it, love. Come to grandmother. There's so much I need to tell you about our family, about what you're carrying." The words stopped Sarah cold. What you're carrying, not who, what. The phosphorescent glow from the symbols intensified, and in that eerie light, Sarah finally saw the rest of the journal entries carved into the stone. Her eyes, now adjusted to reading the archaic script, moved frantically across the surface. "The child must be born within the sacred space when the moon is dark," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Only then can the bloodline be preserved, the ancient pact fulfilled. The mother is but a vessel, her purpose served when the offspring draws its first breath." Her hands flew to her swollen belly as the terrible truth crashed over her. The dreams, the compulsions, the overwhelming need to come to this place, none of it had been coincidence. She'd been guided here, manipulated by forces she was only beginning to understand. "Open the door, Sarah." The voice outside had changed, losing its warmth. Now it carried undertones of command, of power that brooked no resistance. "Your time has come." The child grows impatient. As if responding to the voice, Sarah felt a sharp pain tear through her abdomen. Too early, her rational mind screamed. The baby wasn't due for another month, but as another contraction ripped through her, she realized with mounting terror that timing had nothing to do with medical charts or human biology. The ancient stones around her seemed to pulse with anticipation, and she understood with crystal clarity that she hadn't found shelter in this hut by accident. She'd been brought here to fulfill a purpose that had been set in motion long before her birth. The door handle began to turn. The journal's pages felt like dead skin beneath Sarah's trembling fingers as she turned to the next entry. The candlelight flickered across words that seemed to writhe in the dancing shadows, and she had to blink several times to bring them into focus. March 15th, 1847. The children have begun to change. Little Margaret's eyes have grown so pale they're nearly white, and she speaks of things that haven't happened yet. Yesterday she told me that the minister's wife would fall down the church steps and lose her child. This morning word came that it had happened exactly as she described. Thomas grows stronger each day, unnaturally so. I found him in the barn lifting stones that should take 3 grown men to move. And the baby, sweet Mary. She hasn't cried once since the ritual. Not once. She simply watches with those ancient eyes, as if she's seen centuries pass. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, The baby inside her shifted restlessly, as if responding to her rising panic. She forced herself to continue reading, though every instinct screamed at her to throw the journal into the fire and run. The townspeople are beginning to notice. Mrs. Henderson asked pointed questions about Margaret's gift at the market today. I saw the fear in her eyes, the way she made the sign of the cross when she thought I wasn't looking. We cannot stay much longer. The thing that gave us this power, this curse, it demands payment. It whispers to me in the night, telling me what must be done to keep the bloodline pure, to ensure the gift passes down unchanged. I fear I have damned not just my children, but their children, and their children's children. The ritual cannot be undone. The blood debt must be paid with each generation. Or else, I dare not think of what happens if we fail to honor the bargain. The pages grew more frantic after that, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scratches. Sarah read about the family's flight from town to town, always one step ahead of suspicion and fear. She learned about the careful arrangements made to hide their nature, the false names and fabricated histories, and she discovered the terrible truth about what happened to those who carried the bloodline. Every generation, one was chosen. One had to return to the place where it all began, to make the payment required by whatever dark entity had granted their ancestors' desperate wish. The chosen one would bear a child here, in this very hut, and that child would either appease the hunger of the thing that dwelt in the stones or become its vessel in the world. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she read the final entry in Rebecca's handwriting. I understand now why Mother brought me here, why she told me the stories, why she made me memorize the words. I am the payment for this generation. My child will either feed the darkness or become its instrument. There is no other choice. The bloodline demands it. God forgive me, I cannot fight what lives in my very bones. The journal fell from Sarah's nerveless fingers as understanding crashed over her like an avalanche. Her grandmother's strange stories, the family's tendency to avoid certain places and dates, her mother's fearful warnings about staying away from the mountains during winter storms. It all made horrible sense now. She had been drawn here not by chance or desperation, but by something older and hungrier than human understanding. The blizzard hadn't trapped her, it had herded her, like a shepherd driving sheep toward slaughter. The baby moved again, more violently this time, and Sarah gasped at the sudden sharp pain that lanced through her abdomen. It felt different from the earlier contractions, purposeful, as if the child inside her was responding to some unheard call. The wind outside had grown eerily quiet, and in that unnatural stillness, Sarah heard something that made her blood turn to ice. Footsteps, slow, measured, circling the hut. But there was something wrong with the sound. It was too heavy, too deliberate, and it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. She crawled to the window and peered through the gap she had cleared in the ice earlier. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Then, at the edge of her vision, she caught a glimpse of movement. Figures, tall and impossibly thin, moving with fluid grace through the storm. Their faces were pale blurs in the darkness, but she could feel their attention focused on the hut with predatory intensity. They were waiting for her to fulfill the bargain that had been made generations ago, waiting for her to provide what had been promised. The payment was due, and she was the currency. Another contraction hit her, stronger than before, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that her body was no longer entirely her own. The thing in the stones was calling, and every cell in her being was programmed to answer. She was Rebecca's descendant, shaped by generations of careful breeding and dark purpose. The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah felt something else, a presence, ancient and patient, reaching through her bloodline to claim what it had been promised so long ago. The wind had stopped completely. Elena pressed her ear against the rough stone wall, straining to hear even the faintest whisper of the blizzard that had been raging for hours, but there was nothing. The silence felt unnatural, heavy with anticipation, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. She pulled the ancient journal closer to her chest. its leather binding warm against her fingers despite the cold that had seeped into her bones. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence now, responding to her presence in ways that defied explanation. Each character appeared to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at it, creating patterns that made her stomach churn with recognition she couldn't quite place. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, more insistent than before. Elena winced, placing her hand over the spot where tiny feet or fists pushed against her flesh. "I know," she whispered to her unborn child. "I feel it too." Something was awakening in the hut. She could sense it in the way the air seemed to thicken, becoming almost syrupy with an energy that made her skin crawl. The temperature hadn't changed, but warmth was spreading through the stone floor beneath her, as if ancient fires were being rekindled in chambers far below. Elena forced herself to open the journal again, her hands trembling as she turned to a page she hadn't noticed before. The parchment felt different here, newer somehow, though the writing was in the same archaic script. As she focused on the words, they began to rearrange themselves, forming sentences in modern English that made her blood run cold. "The seventh daughter of the seventh daughter shall bear the vessel. When the old blood calls, she must answer. The compact cannot be broken." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, fragments of lullabies and bedtime stories that had seemed innocent then but now carried sinister undertones. Stories about women in their family who disappeared during harsh winters, who walked into storms and never returned. Stories about babies born during the darkest nights of the year, marked with strange birthmarks that looked like ancient symbols. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her left shoulder, where a crescent-shaped mark had adorned her skin since birth. A mother had always dismissed it as a harmless birthmark, but now Elena remembered her grandmother reaction the first time she'd seen it. The old woman had gone pale, crossing herself repeatedly while muttering prayers in a language Elena had never heard before. The journal's pages fluttered without any breeze to move them, settling on an illustration that made Elena's heart stop. The drawing showed a woman, heavily pregnant, kneeling in what was unmistakably this very hut. Around her, shadowy figures formed a circle, their faces obscured but their intentions clear. Above the woman's head, symbols floated in the air, and from her belly came a light that seemed to feed the darkness rather than dispel it. "No," Elena breathed, scrambling backward until her spine hit the wall. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies. Everything was real. The hut, the journal, the presence that was growing stronger with each passing moment. Her family's disappearances, the stories, the way her grandmother had always insisted Elena was special. It had all been leading to this moment, to this place. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Elena could feel something responding from deep within her womb, as if the baby was answering a call she couldn't hear. The child moved constantly now, pressing against her skin with an urgency that bordered on violence. She tried to stand, desperate to escape, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. The warmth from the floor had become heat, and with it came a sound like distant chanting. Voices speaking in harmonies that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. Words in languages that predated civilization. The journal fell open to its final pages, revealing detailed instructions written in what looked like dried blood. Elena read them with growing horror, understanding now why her family's women had vanished, why they'd been drawn to isolated places during the worst storms. They hadn't been victims of nature or circumstance. They had been fulfilling an ancient obligation. The chanting grew louder, and Elena realized with sick certainty that it wasn't coming from below the hut. The voices were inside her head, had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. They spoke of debts owed and promises kept, of power that came with a price that had been paid in blood for generations. Outside, despite the complete absence of wind, something was moving through the snow. Elena could hear it circling the hut with deliberate steps, each footfall perfectly timed with the contractions that had begun to ripple across her swollen belly. The baby was coming, and with it, something far older and more terrible than anything she had ever imagined. The ancient text crumbled at the edges as Elena's trembling fingers traced the faded ink. Each word felt like a weight settling in her chest, heavier than the child she carried. The language was archaic, but she could make out enough to understand the horror spelled out in meticulous detail. The binding of the 13th generation. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the margins, notes scrawled in a mixture of languages, Spanish, Latin, and something else entirely, symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. Elena's breath came in short gasps as she read about rituals, about children born under specific circumstances, about bloodlines that stretched back to the old country, about vessels. The wind outside had died to an eerie whisper, as if the storm itself was listening. Elena looked up from the journal to find the carved faces on the walls watching her with what seemed like anticipation. The baby kicked violently, as though trying to escape what was coming. She forced herself to keep reading. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed through the years, documenting her family's desperate attempts to break free from something that had bound them for generations. Her great-great-grandmother had tried to burn the bloodline records. She'd disappeared 3 days later, found frozen solid in a field miles from her home, her face twisted in an expression of absolute terror. Elena's Aunt Sophia had attempted to flee to Europe with her newborn daughter. The ship never reached port. 27 souls lost at sea, including Sophia and little Carmen. The family never spoke of them again. Then came the entry that made Elena's blood turn to ice water in her veins. December 15th, 1987. Maria is with child again. We had hoped the curse would skip her, as it did her sister, but the signs are unmistakable. The child quickens during the dark hours. She speaks to things that are not there. The old hunger grows in her eyes. We must prepare for what is coming. The 13th generation draws near, and with it, the completion of what our ancestors began. God forgive us all. Elena's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the journal. 1987, the year before she was born. Her mother had never mentioned being pregnant before Elena, had never spoken of losing a child, but here it was, documented in her grandmother's careful script. She flipped frantically through the remaining pages, searching for answers. The entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scratches across the yellowed paper. January 3rd, 1988. The first child was taken in the night. Maria does not remember, but I saw what came for it. The old compact holds. One child to feed the ancient hunger, one to carry on the bloodline. Elena remains, praise be, but I fear what grows in the shadows, what waits for the 13th generation to come of age. Elena's vision blurred. A sister. She'd had a sister. Something had taken her sister, and her mother. The candles flickered as footsteps echoed from somewhere deep within the stone walls. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to come from below, from within the very foundation of the hut. Elena pressed herself against the wall, the journal clutched to her chest. The final entry was dated just 3 months before her grandmother's death. The compact weakens with each generation, but it endures. Elena must never know the truth, must never come to this place. I have hidden the key, destroyed the maps. Let the old ways die with me. Let this cursed bloodline end in ignorance rather than in willing sacrifice. But Elena was here. She had found the key, had been drawn to this place as surely as if something had been calling her home. The baby's movements had grown frantic, painful kicks that stole her breath. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by something else, a sound like whispers in a language that predated human speech. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Elena's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. She turned the page with numb fingers and found one last entry, written in a different hand entirely. The ink looked fresh, impossibly fresh. Welcome home, Elena. The 13th generation begins with you. The candles went out all at once, plunging the room into absolute darkness. But Elena could still see, somehow. could see the walls beginning to shift and change, revealing passages that hadn't been there moments before, could see shapes moving in the shadows, shapes that had been waiting patiently for her arrival. The baby gave one final violent kick, and Elena felt something warm and wet between her legs. Too early, far too early, but the contractions were already beginning. Her body was no longer her own, responding to something older than human will. In the darkness, something that might once have been her sister began to laugh. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, matching the frantic beating of Elena's heart. She pressed her palm against the ancient stone, feeling the carved lines like scars beneath her fingertips. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to some unseen force radiating from the markings. "This can't be real," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, fragments of memory began surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. Her grandmother's hushed conversations that stopped whenever Elena entered the room, the way her mother had destroyed all the old family photographs, the reason they'd moved so far from the mountains when Elena was 7. The wind outside had grown impossibly fierce, rattling the ancient door until she feared it might splinter. But worse than the storm was the growing certainty that something else was trapped in here with her, something that had been waiting. Elena's flashlight beam trembled as she traced the symbols across the wall. They formed a pattern she almost recognized, like a half-remembered lullaby. The curved lines and angular cuts told a story, and with growing horror she began to understand what it meant. Birth, death, sacrifice, return. The cycle repeated across the entire wall, each iteration growing more elaborate, more detailed. At the center, carved deeper than the rest, was a symbol that made her blood freeze. A woman with swollen belly, arms raised toward a crescent moon. Around her, smaller figures knelt in worship or supplication. Elena's legs gave out, and she sank onto the stone floor, her back against the opposite wall. The baby's movements had become almost painful now, sharp jabs that seemed to follow no natural rhythm. She placed both hands on her stomach, trying to calm whatever was happening inside her. "Grandmother knew," she said aloud, her voice barely audible above the storm. "That's why she gave me the compass. That's why she made me promise to come here if I was ever in danger." But as the realization settled over her, she understood with crystalline clarity that her grandmother hadn't sent her here for shelter. She'd sent her here for something far more terrible. The temperature in the hut was dropping rapidly now, her breath forming white clouds that dispersed into the stagnant air. The flashlight flickered, and in the moments of near darkness between flickers, she could swear she saw shadows moving along the walls. Not cast by anything in the room, but moving independently, reaching toward her with grasping fingers. Elena fumbled for her phone, desperate for any connection to the outside world, but the screen remained black, dead. The compass her grandmother had given her lay beside her, its needle spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north, unable to find anything stable in this place where the normal rules seemed to bend and break. A sound came from somewhere deep within the stone walls. Not the wind, not settling timber, but something organic. A breathing that seemed to echo from multiple sources at once. Elena held her own breath, straining to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then she saw it. In the far corner where the shadows were deepest, the stone itself appeared to be moving, not cracking or shifting, but undulating like water, like flesh. A section of the wall was pushing outward, forming the vague outline of a human figure trying to emerge from solid rock. Elena's scream caught in her throat as she recognized the shape. The same proportions as the central figure carved into the wall, a pregnant woman, arms reaching forward, mouth open in an expression that could have been ecstasy or agony. The baby inside her kicked so hard she doubled over, gasping. When she looked up again, the stone figure had pushed further from the wall, its features becoming more distinct. The face was her grandmother's, but decades younger. The face from photographs Elena had glimpsed before they were all destroyed. "No," Elena whispered, but the figure continued to emerge, stone becoming flesh, ancient becoming immediate. This isn't possible. The thing that wore her grandmother's face turned its head toward Elena with movements that seemed to skip frames, jerky and unnatural. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through mountain passes, hollow and endless. Every generation, it said, one must return. One must complete the cycle. I returned. My mother returned. Her mother before her. Elena pressed herself harder against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. The door remained sealed against the storm, and the window was too small to crawl through, even if she weren't 8 months pregnant. The bloodline must continue, the figure continued, taking a step forward on legs that seemed to be carved from moonlight and shadow. The old agreements must be honored. What was promised must be delivered. The baby's movements were becoming rhythmic now, almost like a heartbeat, but far too fast for anything human. Elena looked down at her swollen belly and saw something that made her soul shrink in terror. Symbols were appearing on her skin. The same markings from the wall, glowing faintly beneath her flesh like veins filled with starlight. Sarah's scream died in her throat as the basement door slammed shut above her, plunging her into absolute darkness. The stone steps beneath her feet felt slick with moisture, and the air grew thicker with each breath. Her phone's flashlight had died when she dropped it, leaving her with nothing but the faint glow emanating from somewhere deeper in the bowels of the hut. The baby kicked violently against her ribs, as if sensing the malevolence that permeated this place. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. The temperature down here was wrong, not the natural cold of winter, but something else entirely, something that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Following the ghostly light, she descended deeper into what she now realized wasn't just a basement, but a network of tunnels carved directly into the mountain. The walls bore the same strange symbols she'd seen upstairs, but these were different, older, more elaborate, and they seemed to pulse with that same sickly luminescence. Her foot struck something solid, and she looked down to see bones scattered across the tunnel floor. Not animal bones, human. Small ones mixed with larger skulls, some still bearing wisps of hair, children's bones. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she stumbled backward, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. That's when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. Singing. A woman's voice, low and melodious, echoing from the depths of the tunnel system. The language was unfamiliar, guttural and ancient, but somehow Sarah understood every word. It was a lullaby about feeding time. The singing grew louder as she moved forward, drawn by some compulsion she couldn't resist. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber carved from living rock, its ceiling lost in shadows. Symbols covered every surface, glowing with increasing intensity as her presence activated something dormant in the stone. In the center of the chamber sat a woman. Sarah's grandmother looked exactly as she had in the faded photograph upstairs, unchanged by the decades that should have aged her beyond recognition. Her silver hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her pale eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression of terrible love. "My dear girl," Margaret Blackwood said, her voice carrying impossible warmth. "You've finally come home." Sarah tried to speak, but no words came. Her grandmother rose gracefully, moving with fluid steps that seemed to glide rather than walk. As she approached, Sarah could see that her skin was translucent, veins visible beneath like dark rivers. "I've been waiting so long for you to understand," Margaret continued, circling Sarah slowly. "The gifts in our bloodline, the hunger that calls to us in the dark hours. Did you think your mother's appetites were normal? The way she would disappear for days, returning with that satisfied look?" Images flashed through Sarah's mind, childhood memories she'd buried deep, her mother's late-night absences, the strange smells that sometimes clung to her clothes, the way other children in town would go missing, and her mother would grow calm and content for weeks afterward. "No," Sarah whispered, finally finding her voice. "That's not, she wouldn't." Oh, but she would. She did. Just as her mother before her and her mother before that. We are an old family, Sarah, with old needs. The hunger is part of us, woven into our very essence. Margaret's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too many. And now it's time for you to embrace what you are. The baby inside her kicked again, but this time it felt different, violent, predatory. Sarah gasped as pain shot through her abdomen, and she looked down to see dark veins spreading across her skin like ink in water. "The child knows," Margaret said with satisfaction. "It can sense its inheritance awakening in you. The blizzard brought you here for a reason, dear one. This is where it begins for each generation, where we learn to feed." Sarah stumbled backward, but the chamber walls seemed to shift and move, trapping her in the center with her grandmother. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster now, matching the rhythm of her panicked heartbeat. "I won't," Sarah gasped. "Whatever this is, whatever you want me to become, I won't do it." Margaret's laughter echoed through the chamber like breaking glass. "You think you have a choice? The hunger is already growing inside you. I can see it in your eyes, smell it on your skin. You're changing just as your mother did when she carried you, just as I did when I carried her." The pain in Sarah's belly intensified, and she felt something shift inside her, not just the baby, but something else, something dark and ravenous unfurling like poisonous flowers. Her vision sharpened, and suddenly she could see things in the shadows that hadn't been there before, moving shapes, waiting forms. "Welcome to the family business," Margaret whispered, reaching out with hands that ended in claws. The storm's fury had awakened something else in the hut, something that made Sarah's blood run cold despite the fire's warmth. The shadows seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the carved symbols on the walls began to glow with an otherworldly light that had nothing to do with the flames. Margaret Blackwood's journal trembled in Sarah's hands as she read the final entries, each word confirming her worst fears. The ritual hadn't ended with her ancestor's death. It had been passed down, generation to generation, waiting for the right moment to complete itself. And Sarah, carrying new life within her womb, was the perfect vessel. "The child must be born here," she whispered, reading Margaret's spidery handwriting. "Where the veil is thinnest, where the ancient ones can cross over, only then will the pact be fulfilled." The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her words, and Sarah gasped as pain shot through her abdomen. She wasn't due for another month, but the contractions that had started during her desperate flight through the blizzard were growing stronger. The timing wasn't coincidental. It couldn't be. She struggled to her feet, clutching the journal, and moved toward the door. But the moment she touched the ancient wood, it refused to budge. The metal latch felt scorching hot beneath her fingers, and when she pulled her hand away, a mark had been burned into her palm, the same twisted symbol that adorned the walls. "No, no, no," she muttered, throwing her shoulder against the door. It remained sealed, as if the very stones of the hut conspired to keep her trapped. The wind outside had shifted from a natural howl to something that sounded almost like chanting, voices carried on the Arctic air. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and Sarah doubled over with a cry. The baby was coming whether she wanted it to or not. She looked around desperately, her gaze falling on the strange altar-like stone in the corner. Dark stains covered its surface, and she now understood what they were. Blood from countless sacrifices, countless births that had fed the hungry darkness waiting beyond the veil. The journal slipped from her fingers as she sank to her knees, pages fluttering open to reveal detailed anatomical drawings and ritualistic instructions written in multiple hands across different centuries. Each generation of Blackwood women had added their own notes, their own terrible knowledge to the collection. "Sarah Blackwood," a voice whispered from the shadows, and she looked up to see a figure materializing near the altar. It was Margaret, or what remained of her, a wraith-like presence with hollow eyes and fingers that dripped with ethereal blood. "You cannot run from what you are. I'm not like you," Sarah gasped between contractions. "I won't do this." Margaret's ghostly form drifted closer. "You think you have a choice? Look at yourself, child. Look at what flows in your veins." Against her will, Sarah found herself staring at her own hands. The veins beneath her pale skin seemed darker than they should be, pulsing with something that wasn't entirely blood. The mark on her palm was spreading, creeping up her wrist like living ink. "Every Blackwood woman has stood where you stand now," Margaret continued. "Every one of them believed they could change their fate. But the pact was sealed in stone and blood centuries ago. The ancient ones have been patient, but their hunger grows with each passing generation." The fire in the hearth suddenly flared, casting dancing shadows on the walls that looked like reaching claws. In the flames, Sarah could see other faces, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and women stretching back through time, all wearing the same expression of resigned horror she now felt settling over her own features. "What do they want?" she whispered. "To return," Margaret said simply. "This world was theirs long before humans walked upon it. We are merely the doorway they need to reclaim what was stolen from them. And your child," she gestured towards Sarah's swollen belly, "will be their first true vessel, born in this sacred place where the barriers are weakest." Sarah's water broke in a warm rush, and she cried out as the most powerful contraction yet seized her body. The baby was coming now, ready or not, and she could feel something else pressing against the edges of her consciousness, an alien presence trying to worm its way into her mind. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and the temperature in the hut began to drop despite the roaring fire. Frost formed on the windows in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. "Fight it," Sarah whispered to herself. Then louder, "Fight it!" But even as she spoke the words, she could feel her resistance crumbling. The pain was overwhelming, and in that agony, the ancient presence found its opening. It rushed into her like ice water through her veins, carrying with it the accumulated weight of centuries of dark worship and terrible purpose. The real battle was only beginning. The binding ritual had begun decades before Sarah was even born, woven into her family's bloodline by her grandmother's desperate hands. As she pressed her palm against the rough stone wall, the memories that weren't her own continued to flood through her consciousness like poison in her veins. Margaret Ashford had been 19 when she first encountered the entity that would haunt 3 generations of women. It was 1952, and she had sought shelter in this very hut during a spring storm, her belly round with Sarah's mother. The creature had been weaker then, newly awakened from centuries of slumber, hungry but not yet fully formed. Margaret had made a choice that night, a mother's choice born of terror and love. Sarah could feel it now, the weight of that ancient pact pressing down on her lungs. Her grandmother had offered herself as a vessel, but with conditions. The entity could feed, but only from the women of their bloodline, and only when they carried new life. It would sustain itself on their fear, their pain, their very essence, but it would be bound to protect the children until they came of age to bear offspring of their own. "She saved me," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her as another contraction gripped her body. "She saved Mom. She saved all of us." But the cost had been immense. Margaret had withered away over the years, her life force slowly drained until she was nothing but a hollow shell. Sarah's mother had fared better, learning to hide, to stay away during her pregnancies. She had given birth to Sarah in a hospital 300 miles away, breaking the creature's feeding cycle and weakening it further. Now it was starving. Sarah could feel its desperation clawing at the edges of her mind, see through its ancient eyes as it circled the hut like a predator. The blizzard outside wasn't natural. It was the creature's doing, its way of ensuring she couldn't escape before the birth, before it could complete what Margaret had started all those years ago. The entity wanted more than just to feed this time. It wanted to break free from the binding entirely, to use Sarah's child as an anchor to the physical world. If it succeeded, the careful balance Margaret had struck would shatter, and the creature would be free to hunt beyond their bloodline. Sarah struggled to her feet, one hand bracing against the wall while the other cradled her swollen belly. The symbols carved into the stone were glowing brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could read them somehow, understanding their meaning as if the knowledge had been passed down through her very DNA. They weren't just binding symbols, they were instructions. Margaret had left her a way out, but it required a sacrifice that made Sarah's blood run cold. The ritual could be broken, the entity banished back to whatever dark realm it had crawled from, but only if the current vessel willingly gave up her connection to the bloodline. Sarah would have to sever the tie that bound her family to the creature, cutting herself off from the protection it offered, but also from any future generations. Her daughter would be free, but Sarah would not survive the severance. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Sarah bit back a scream. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and with each wave of pain she could feel the entity growing stronger. It was feeding on her fear, her anguish, preparing itself for the moment of birth when the barrier between worlds would be at its thinnest. She pressed both hands against the symbols now, feeling their heat burn through her palms. The ritual words came unbidden to her lips, spoken in a language that predated recorded history. As she chanted, the walls of the hut began to shake, and the wind outside rose to a deafening howl. The entity was fighting back. Sarah felt it slam into her mind like a physical blow, trying to stop her from completing the severance. Images flashed before her eyes, her daughter growing up alone, never knowing why her mother had died in a snowstorm, never understanding the dark legacy that had been passed down through their family. But there were other images too, her daughter living free, choosing her own path, bearing children who would never know the touch of ancient evil. The choice was clear, even if it broke her heart. As another contraction gripped her, Sarah poured all of her remaining strength into the ritual. The symbols blazed with white-hot light, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a chain snapping under immense pressure. The connection that had bound her family for generations began to fray, and with it, her own life force started to ebb. But the entity's hold on her was weakening too, its influence growing dim as the ancient pact crumbled. Sarah smiled through her tears, knowing that her sacrifice would buy her daughter something that no woman in their family had possessed for 70 years: freedom. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own as Sarah traced her trembling finger along the carved stone. Each mark triggered a flood of images, memories that weren't hers, yet felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. The ritual chamber beneath the hut had become a gateway to centuries of accumulated knowledge, and she was drowning in its overwhelming current. "The bloodline must continue," she whispered, the words emerging unbidden from her lips. They tasted of copper and ash, of countless women who had spoken them before her in this very place. Above, the blizzard raged with supernatural fury, as if the earth itself was responding to her awakening. But Sarah barely noticed the howling wind anymore. Her attention was consumed by the revelations spreading through her consciousness like wildfire. She wasn't just descended from the ancient guardians. She was their direct heir, the last in an unbroken line stretching back to the first settlers who had bound themselves to this cursed land. The pregnancy. It all made sense now. The timing wasn't coincidental. The child growing within her wasn't simply her daughter. It was the next vessel, the continuation of a pact that demanded sacrifice in exchange for protection. Her ancestors had volunteered their bloodline to serve as wardens for something that should never have been disturbed. Sarah's hand moved to her swollen belly as another contraction gripped her. The labor was intensifying, driven not just by natural forces, but by the ancient magic that recognized its time had come. The chamber seemed to breathe around her, walls expanding and contracting in rhythm with her own breathing. Through the stone floor she felt it stirring again, the presence that had been contained here for generations. Her family had been its jailers, but also its sustenance. Each generation had fed it just enough to keep it dormant, offering their life force in carefully measured doses. But something had gone wrong. The balance had been disrupted. "Mother never told me," Sarah gasped between contractions, understanding flooding through her with crystal clarity. Her mother's early death hadn't been an accident or illness. It had been the price paid for breaking the chain, for trying to escape the family obligation. When she'd taken Sarah away from this place as a child, she'd thought she could sever the connection. Instead, she'd only delayed the inevitable. The entity below grew more restless with each passing moment, sensing the proximity of fresh blood, young blood. Sarah could feel its hunger like a physical weight pressing up through the stone. It had waited decades for her return, growing stronger in its anticipation. But there was something else in the inherited memories, something her mother had discovered too late. The binding wasn't just about feeding the creature, it was about maintaining a delicate prison. Without the willing sacrifice of each generation, the containment would eventually fail completely. The blizzards, the strange accidents that had plagued the region for the past 20 years, they were all signs that the seal was weakening. Another contraction doubled her over, and Sarah realized with growing horror that her labor was accelerating the breakdown. The act of birth in this sacred space was meant to transfer the guardianship to the next generation, but it required a ritual that she didn't know how to perform. Without the proper ceremony, the birth would simply shatter what remained of the ancient barriers. She pressed her palms against the carved altar, feeling the stone warm beneath her touch. The symbols seemed to rearrange themselves before her eyes, showing her glimpses of the ritual she needed to perform. It would require a choice: sacrifice herself to strengthen the binding for another generation, or find another way to break the cycle entirely. The wind above suddenly ceased, leaving an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She knew that meant the entity was gathering its strength, preparing for what might be its first taste of freedom in centuries. Time was running out faster than she'd anticipated. Through the stone beneath her feet, she felt movement, not the shifting of earth or settling of ancient foundations, but something deliberately positioning itself directly below her. It knew she was here. It knew what was happening, and it was positioning itself to strike the moment the barriers failed. Sarah closed her eyes and reached deeper into the ancestral memories, searching desperately for alternatives her forebears might have considered but never used. There had to be another way. Some escape clause or hidden option that didn't require her to perpetuate the cycle of sacrifice. Then she found it, buried deep in the oldest memories, so dangerous that it had been deliberately obscured by subsequent generations. A way to end the binding permanently, but at a cost that would affect far more than just her own bloodline. The choice would transform everything, not just her fate, but the very nature of the power that slumbered beneath the earth. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and Sarah knew she was out of time for preparation. The moment of decision had arrived, and whatever choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not only her survival, but the future of everyone who might ever set foot on this cursed ground. The wind howled through the gaps in the ancient stones as Sarah pressed herself against the cold wall, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. The journal trembled in her hands, its pages now brittle with age and moisture. Everything she had believed about her family, about herself, crumbled with each revelation the leather-bound book contained. Her grandmother's handwriting sprawled across the yellowed pages in fevered scrawls, documenting rituals Sarah had never imagined possible. The hut wasn't just shelter, it was a sanctuary built specifically for women of their bloodline, a place where the family's darkest secret had been practiced for generations. The baby kicked violently inside her, as if responding to some unseen presence. Sarah gasped, placing both hands on her swollen belly. The movement felt different now, more purposeful, almost conscious. She thought of her grandmother's final entry, "The child knows. They always know when it's time." A scratching sound echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. Sarah's head snapped up, scanning the shadows that seemed to writhe and dance in the flickering candlelight. The flame guttered, sending wild shadows across the carved symbols that covered every surface of the hut's interior. Those symbols, she understood them now. They weren't decorative, they were instructions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, "Roads clearing, coming for you," but even as relief flooded through her, a darker realization crept in. Marcus couldn't find her like this, not knowing what she now knew, not carrying what she was carrying. The journal detailed everything: how her great-great-grandmother had built this place after fleeing the old country, how each generation had returned here when their time came. The women in her family weren't just carriers of life, they were vessels for something far older, something that had traveled across oceans and through centuries, waiting for the right bloodline to complete its purpose. Sarah's mother had died in childbirth. Her grandmother had always said it was complications, but the journal told a different story. Her mother had fought it. She had tried to break the cycle, and the entity wouldn't allow it. The final entry about her mother was brief but chilling. She chose to resist. The line nearly ended with her defiance. But Sarah had survived that birth somehow. A miracle baby, everyone had called her. Now she understood why. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It came from behind the altar-like stone structure at the far end of the hut. Sarah approached slowly, the journal clutched to her chest like a shield. The carved depression in the stone surface was stained dark, not with age, but with something else entirely. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the pages, "When the time comes, you'll understand. The child isn't yours to keep. It never was." The baby's movements became frantic, and Sarah doubled over with sudden, sharp pain. Too early. It was too early. But as she looked down at her belly, she could see shapes pressing against her skin from the inside, shapes that didn't look remotely human. The candle flame suddenly blazed higher, illuminating the entire hut with an unnatural blue-white light. In that stark illumination, Sarah could see them clearly. Dozens of carved faces in the walls, all bearing her features, all wearing expressions of profound sorrow. Her ancestors, trapped forever in stone, bearing witness to what was about to unfold. A new voice filled her mind, ancient and patient. "We have waited so long, child, so very long." Sarah stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The door had somehow sealed itself, though she couldn't remember hearing it close. The wind outside had stopped completely, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against her eardrums. The journal fell from her nerveless fingers as another contraction seized her. This time, she felt something else, a presence, vast and hungry, pressing against the boundaries of her consciousness. It had been growing alongside the baby, feeding on her life force, preparing for this moment. Her grandmother had left one final page, written in a different hand. Shaky, desperate, there might be a way to stop it. The old binding spell if you're strong enough. But the price? Sarah never got to read what the price was. The page had been torn away, leaving only the ragged edge of paper and the growing certainty that she was running out of time. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus was getting closer, sweet, unsuspecting Marcus, who had no idea what kind of family he had married into. The entity stirred with renewed interest at the thought of him. It would need a new host after tonight, someone to help raise what was coming. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember everything her grandmother had taught her about their heritage, not the sanitized stories she'd shared over tea and cookies, but the older knowledge that lived in blood and bone. Somewhere in those half-forgotten lessons lay her only chance of breaking free from the destiny her bloodline had carried for centuries. The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah could swear she heard it laugh. The ancient symbols on the walls began to glow with an otherworldly light as Elena pressed her palm against the cold stone. The wind outside had died to an unnatural stillness, but the real storm was raging within her mind as fragments of suppressed memories crashed together like ice flows in a churning river. She was no longer Elena Morrison, the architect fleeing an abusive marriage. She was Elena Blackthorne, descendant of a bloodline that stretched back centuries to this very place. The stone hut wasn't just shelter from the blizzard. It was the ancestral heart of her family's dark legacy, and she had been drawn here by forces older than conscious thought. The bones scattered across the floor weren't random victims of winter's cruelty. They were offerings, sacrifices, the price her bloodline had paid for generations to maintain their covenant with something that existed in the spaces between life and death. Her hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly as another contraction rippled through her. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing the change in its mother, the awakening of something that had been dormant in her blood since birth. Elena gasped as the truth crystallized with devastating clarity. The child she carried wasn't just any baby. It was the next in line, the continuation of a pact made in desperation by her ancestors when famine and plague had threatened to destroy their village. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and she could hear them now, whispers in a language that predated written history, yet somehow she understood every word. They spoke of the Blackthorn Covenant, of power granted in exchange for blood, of protection bought with the sacrifice of the firstborn of each generation. Her grandmother hadn't died in that house fire when Elena was 7. She had been taken, claimed by the entity that had sustained their family for centuries. And now it was Elena's turn to choose. The wooden chest in the corner creaked open on its own, revealing not just the journal she had read, but artifacts that told the complete story. A silver blade etched with those same glowing symbols, vials of dark liquid that seemed to move with their own consciousness, and photographs, dozens of them, showing Blackthorn women standing in this very hut, their faces resigned, their hands resting on swollen bellies just like hers. Elena's mother stared back at her from one of the photographs, young and terrified, holding the same blade Elena now found in her own trembling hand. She understood now why her mother had fled, why she had changed their name, why she had spent Elena's childhood moving from town to town, always looking over her shoulder. She had broken the covenant, refused to honor the pact, and had spent her life hiding from the consequences. But the entity had been patient. It had waited, knowing that blood calls to blood, knowing that eventually Elena would find her way here. The blizzard hadn't been coincidence. It had been guidance, herding her like a sheep to slaughter toward this moment of terrible choice. The contractions were coming faster now, and Elena realized with mounting horror that her labor wasn't progressing naturally. The entity was controlling it, timing it, preparing for the ritual that would either bind her child to the covenant or claim it entirely if she refused. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel an alien presence pressing against her mind, trying to override her will with the accumulated weight of centuries. But Elena had inherited more than just the Blackthorn blood. She had inherited their strength, their cunning, and their capacity for sacrifice. As another contraction racked her body, she raised the silver blade not toward her belly, but toward her own palm. Her blood hit the ancient stone with a hiss, and the symbols flared so bright she had to close her eyes. When she opened them again, she wasn't alone in the hut. The entity stood before her, no longer hiding behind whispers and moving shadows. It was beautiful and terrible, ancient beyond measure, its form shifting between woman and shadow, predator and protector. It had been both blessing and curse to her family, saving them from extinction while demanding an unthinkable price. "You understand now," it said, its voice like wind through dry leaves. "You know what you must do." Elena met its gaze without flinching, her hand still bleeding onto the stone, her other hand protective over her belly. "Yes," she said quietly, "I know exactly what I must do." But as she spoke those words, Elena smiled, expression that would have been familiar to anyone who had known the Blackthorn women of old. They had always been survivors, always been willing to pay any price to protect what mattered most. The entity thought it understood the choice she would make. It was about to discover how wrong it was. The ancient covenant was about to be rewritten in blood and fire.